Numbers today, of course, coming around unemployment. The simple fact is that while we have created more jobs in the second quarter of this year coming out of the pandemic, we still have officially at least 8 million people who are unemployed, but in reality probably more than that. Well, let's get a deeper understanding of what's really happening and find out more about the lives of people who are technically unemployed are really living. They're not living necessarily without income. Dr. Bernd Mueller is a senior employment specialist at the International Labour Organization South Africa office. Dr. Mueller, good afternoon to you. You point out that when we talk about people who are unemployed, we're not talking about people who don't work. We're often talking about people who are in the informal sector. They're trying to hustle some kind of income. What's really happening? What kind of life are people living?
Sure. Thanks, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we need to separate a few things there if we're talking about unemployment. And we must say, unfortunately, when we talk about employment, we don't even yet talk about the quality of the job. So actually, if you have someone who's in informal employment, they are officially counted as employed. So they are not under the unemployed. But of course, they have the type of employment that's quite poor in terms of the working conditions, the security in the job, certainly social security and so on. There's a lot of what we call decent work deficits. So we often say at the ILO, unemployment really is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so many other issues underlying that really makes people struggle out there. But of course, the numbers there, even on the unemployment, are quite worrying.
We've seen that for South Africa in particular, this is a problem that's really grown, depending on how you look at it, probably continuously, consistently since the 1970s. There was a period around the Football World Cup where unemployment didn't grow and went down slightly, but it's generally grown significantly. I mean, why have policymakers, why have government for so many years, nearly 50 years, just failed to grapple with this? I mean, it seems that Southern Africa, is it completely different to the rest of the world when it comes to creating jobs?
There's a lot in that question, of course, and you're slightly asking a $1 million question there. What do we need to do to really solve this problem? Maybe let's first look at a bit of the positives, because we do see, nowhere near as quick as anyone would be hoping, but we do see a recovery. And that very much is a recovery from the COVID time. So what actually happened, if I look at the bit more recent past, and then we go into the longer term picture, with COVID, many people went into sudden inactivity due to the lockdowns. People couldn't work, they couldn't access the workplace, they couldn't even look for jobs, they weren't allowed to get out of the house. That's what we call inactivity. People can't even look for jobs, or they're not available for jobs. Now that, after COVID that had a huge shock on the economy, as everyone knows, and that now has resolved slowly. So those people are now coming back into employment. And that's actually quite a positive trend, I must say, in many ways, because bringing people out of inactivity traditionally is more difficult actually than bringing them out of unemployment. So seeing that move back towards some sort of normality, although I use this with a lot of caution and caveat, that's a good thing. But that changes nothing from the fact that the unemployment rate still is very, very high, and we have a long way to go. Now, in terms of the policy question that you're asking, these are difficult questions, particularly in the Southern African context. And I would point to one particular issue that I would say is structural transformation. Simply put, the economies in South Africa, but also the neighboring countries, you can say they are simply not able to create the number of jobs for the people who are out there looking for jobs. So we have quite large workforces, quite large labor forces, young labor forces, more young people coming into the labor force, and the economy simply isn't placed to create those jobs. And we really need to look at that, how we can change the structure of the economies to create these jobs, and of course better, decent jobs.
It's interesting, and I think important to note, and you've already alluded to this, that countries like Namibia, Eswatini, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa all have very similar unemployment rates. In other words, do we need to see this more as a regional problem than just a national problem? We can only bring national solutions. Maybe there's some regional solutions. But do we need to be very careful with how we look at this particular problem?
I think it's an interesting approach. I think we need a bit of both. So actually, I can tell you very recently at SADC, the Southern African Development Community, there were discussions at very high level between Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Trade and Industry that we supported from the ILO this meeting. And it's quite a big achievement in the sense that they were coming together and discussing these employment issues and discussing common solutions. And so you see that leaders across the region are really grappling with this and trying to find solutions. And some of the results there were that we need to look into sectoral policy making, we need to look into macroeconomic policy making in a way to shape it to be more pro-employment, more employment intensive, if you like. So yes, these discussions are happening at the regional level because all countries are facing these issues. Now, at the national level in South Africa per se, well, let's put it this way. Each country still has its particular context, its particular needs, particular sectoral setup, and so on. So still, you need to translate them, these regional determinations, to the national context, to domesticate them, so to speak, and come up with the right solutions for South Africa or Namibia, Eswatini, whichever country we're talking about. So it's a mix of both. But indeed, these discussions are going on, and we're trying to support them as best as we can.
There's certain things that history tends to show us does lead to the creation of jobs and help your economy. One of them is just building new, better infrastructure. So in our case, we're a very big, physically big country, a geographically big country. We need more roads. Potholes are a major problem in many places. We've seen construction companies who keep telling us that government is not building new infrastructure. Is that the right place to start? I mean, if we employ people building infrastructure, it will have an economic impact. That, historically, as I understand it, is something that works in terms of development.
It definitely will contribute. I wouldn't say it's the only strategy or the silver bullet, so to speak, to solve this. But infrastructure is very important. And there's actually different ways of how to build infrastructure. You mentioned the example of roads. Now, there's different techniques of building these roads. And then we are, for example, trying to propagate labor-intensive or employment-intensive techniques. So maybe using less heavy machinery, but still building good quality roads, but employing more people, especially in the local communities. So that can be very effective. For example, we are supporting the Expanded Public Works program to implement these type of programs and so on, and then many other sectors. Now, looking beyond infrastructure, which certainly is important, industry is very important, manufacturing. So those are the type of sectors where you can have a lot of value added and you can create a lot of jobs that are not even necessarily very high skilled jobs, in the sense that they can be good for, can I say, mass employment. Of course, we want to have ever better jobs, ever higher skilled jobs, but you need to start somewhere, and industry is usually a good place for that. And in that regard, I must say, one slight aspect of the recent figures that were just released today is that actually the number of jobs in manufacturing have gone down. So that was the one out of only 2 sectors that has shed jobs. And these are the type of trends that worry me a little bit, because we need to have ever more higher productivity jobs, and those would be, for example, in manufacturing. So yes, there's still some way to go.
So, I mean, obviously you're correct when you talk about manufacturing being very important. What we've seen from the demise, the end of our textile sector in the 1990s or close to it, is that it's been very difficult for our manufacturers to compete with China and Vietnam. Are there ways that we can actually compete and therefore create new jobs in our sector?
I would think so. I think every country has a chance to compete fundamentally. It just needs to find the right sectors where it can compete. So I'm not an expert as such in textiles or the textile industry, but it might be one of the cases where it is, and then it depends then on government policy to make that happen. It all depends on setting the right incentives for investment, setting the right conditions that enterprises can strive and work productively in the country, and that they can actually employ people decently. Now that will change from sector to sector, but I happen to know that, for example, the DTIC is working on these sectoral master plans, and they have quite a strong focus actually on the employment content. And again, we're working very closely with them and trying to support them. There is a master plan for textile. I think it's clothing, textile, leather, and footwear, and then they're trying to come up with to identify the constraints and then come up with solutions on how to solve these bottlenecks. Of course, in some sectors this will be harder because of the stiff global competition. In some sectors it will be easier for South Africa. Can't tell you exactly which ones these will be, but I know that there are experts at hand that are looking into it.
And then the other issue, Dr. Mueller, is it seems that two things are happening in South Africa. The one is that despite so many promises of reform and structural reform, it just hasn't happened. The President said during a State of the Nation address in February that there'll be a social compact in 100 days. Well, it's around 250 days and we're still waiting. At the same time, our basic education department, there's some signs that it's improving. But bluntly, if you're a young person growing up in a rural area at a government school, you probably aren't being equipped to be employed in the fourth industrial revolution. Is there a risk that unless we make major changes and make them soon, particularly for young people, as the global north, the richer countries, start to invest more in internet and in those kinds of economies, that we may get further left behind, that it will get harder for young South Africans to get a job in the future, even than it is now?
Yeah, that is a concern, of course. So definitely we need to find ways of catching up, as it were, and then come up with these reform plans that can get South Africa there. Skills is certainly an important area. I would argue it's not the only area. There's a wide array of issues around this 4IR, the fourth industrial revolution, or the future of work, so to speak. Skills is certainly an important area there, but also having the right investment in the right sectors. Now, there are some efforts ongoing. For example, I'm privy to the fact that the Department of Employment and Labour is actually working on a national employment policy, and that is very actively grappling with these issues. There's active discussions happening at NETLAC, the Labour Council, basically, where they have future of work webinars and discussions and try to find ways how South Africa has to adapt and it has to develop to compete in this new environment, so to speak. Again, we're quite closely following and supporting these processes. But beyond that, I would say these are, of course, slightly long-term processes, the policy development, policy implementation. At the same time, we also need to find ways of how to support youth right now. And that calls for a bit more of a hands-on support, be it in enterprise development, value chain development, creating business opportunities and entrepreneurship skills, digital skills, for example, maybe also some opportunities in the green economy, but also the type of interventions that we're doing with the expanded public works program, where we're trying to help people who are in need right now.
Dr. Bernd Mueller, thank you, Senior Employment Specialist at the SA Office of the International Labour Organization. Really do appreciate the time.